Chapter 1: A New Beginning. The gentle hum of the cruise ship's engine rumbled beneath Emily Wilson's feet as she stood on the deck, gazing out at the expanse of azure sea before her. The breeze was warm, a perfect complement to the sun-kissed Caribbean sky that stretched endlessly above. For the first time in months, Emily allowed herself to relax as she leaned against the railing and closed her eyes. She breathed deeply, savoring the salty air. This trip had been a spur-of-the-moment decision. After countless late nights spent buried in reports at her high-stakes advertising job, she knew she needed an escape. Her closest friend, Hannah, had practically pushed her to book the cruise. "A little island hopping, some sun, and a good book will do wonders for you," she'd insisted. And now here she was, with no emails, no deadlines, and no stress. Just peace. The sound of laughter and upbeat calypso music filled the air as fellow passengers mingled around the pool deck. Emily adjusted her wide-brimmed hat and turned to make her way back to her lounge chair, but she collided with a broad chest. The force of the impact sent her reeling backward, her sunglasses slipping from her nose. "I'm so sorry," she blurted out, regaining her balance. She looked up to find herself staring into the most captivating pair of deep blue eyes she had ever seen. The man before her was impeccably dressed in a crisp white linen shirt and tailored trousers, and his sandy hair framed a chiseled jawline. "No harm done," he replied, his voice smooth and warm. He retrieved her sunglasses from the deck and handed them to her with a charming smile. "I'm Dominic Harrington." "Emily Wilson," she replied, slipping her sunglasses back on. "Nice to meet you." He gestured toward the bustling pool area. "Quite the party up here. Looking to join in?" "Maybe later," Emily said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Right now, I'm enjoying the solitude." "A woman after my own heart," Dominic said, his smile widening. "I was just about to head down to the lounge. They say the mojitos there are the best on the ship. Care to join me?" Emily hesitated for a moment, considering his invitation. He was clearly charming, but there was an air of mystery about him that piqued her curiosity. She smiled and nodded. "Sure, I'd love to." Together, they made their way to the lounge, where they were greeted by soft jazz music and a dimly lit bar that overlooked the ocean. Dominic ordered their drinks with the ease of someone who had done this before. "So, Emily, what brings you on this cruise?" "A little vacation," she said as she accepted her mojito from the bartender. "I work in advertising, and it's been a long year." "Ah, the corporate world," Dominic said with a knowing nod. "It can be relentless." "What about you?" she asked, studying his relaxed demeanor. "What do you do?" He took a slow sip of his drink before answering. "A little of this, a little of that. I have some investments that keep me busy, but I'm mostly here for the sun and relaxation." There was something about his response that felt guarded, and Emily couldn't help but wonder what he was holding back. But as they talked and laughed into the evening, sharing stories and dreams, she found herself drawn to his charisma and easy charm. By the time the ship's horn signaled dinner, Emily had almost forgotten her initial hesitations. She felt at ease with Dominic, and as they parted ways at the elevator, she couldn't help but look forward to seeing him again. "Good night, Emily," Dominic said, his gaze lingering on hers. "I hope to see you tomorrow." "Good night," she replied, a smile tugging at her lips. As the elevator doors slid shut, Emily leaned against the wall and let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Something told her this trip was going to be more than just a relaxing getaway. It might just be the beginning of something new. Chapter 2: Unveiling the Mystery. The morning sun broke through the horizon, casting a golden glow over the shimmering sea. Emily awoke early, still wrapped in the lingering warmth of last night's encounter with Dominic. She dressed in a breezy sundress and made her way to the upper deck, hoping to catch the sunrise before the ship docked at their first island stop. As she reached the deck, she found Dominic leaning casually against the railing, his gaze fixed on the brightening horizon. His white shirt fluttered in the breeze, and he looked deep in thought. She hesitated for a moment before walking up beside him. "Good morning," she said softly. He turned to her with a slow smile. "Morning, Emily. You're up early." "So are you," she replied. "Enjoying the view?" "The best way to start the day," he said, looking back at the sea. "The ship will be docking soon." "Any plans for the island?" Emily leaned on the railing and considered the day ahead. "I thought about exploring the old town. I hear there are some great little shops and a market." "What about you?" "I'm planning to check out the local museum and the beach." "You're welcome to join me," Dominic offered, his eyes sparkling. The idea of spending more time with Dominic was appealing, but Emily had to admit she was still curious about him. His vague responses from last night remained on her mind, and she wanted to know more about this enigmatic man. She accepted his invitation, and after a quick breakfast at the cafe, they set off together as the ship docked. They wandered through the cobbled streets of the old town, weaving between colorful market stalls and listening to the lively chatter of vendors. Dominic's ease with people stood out as he charmed the local artisans and shopkeepers, effortlessly switching between English and Spanish. They eventually made their way to the museum, where they admired centuries-old artifacts and local artworks. Dominic seemed particularly knowledgeable about the exhibits, pointing out intricate details and sharing anecdotes about the region's history. "You know a lot about this place," Emily observed as they paused before a display of ancient pottery. "I spent some time in the Caribbean a few years ago," he said casually. "It's always been one of my favorite destinations." His answer left more questions than it answered, but Emily held back. As they made their way to the beach later that afternoon, she noticed the way people looked at Dominic, with a mix of curiosity and recognition. Even the beach bartender greeted him warmly. Sipping a fruity cocktail under the shade of a palm tree, Emily couldn't help but ask, "So, Dominic, I'd been meaning to ask, why does everyone seem to know you?" He chuckled and took a sip of his own drink. "I suppose it's hard to stay anonymous when you travel as much as I do. I've made quite a few friends along the way." "That must be nice," she said, not fully convinced. "It has its moments," he replied with a smile. "But enough about me. What about you?" "Why advertising? It's fast-paced, creative, and unpredictable," she said, brushing sand off her leg. "I guess I enjoy the challenge. Though lately, it's been more stressful than fulfilling." "And that's why you're here," Dominic observed. "To find a little peace." Exactly. The afternoon passed in a comfortable rhythm of laughter, conversation, and a shared love for adventure. As the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched across the sand, Emily knew she had more questions than answers about Dominic. But there was something magnetic about him that kept her intrigued. Returning to the ship, she excused herself to freshen up before dinner. As she reached her cabin, she found a small envelope waiting for her on the dresser. She opened it and found a single white orchid and a note in elegant script. "Meet me at the observation deck tonight at 8. I have something to share with you. Dominic ****. Her curiosity piqued, she dressed in her favorite evening gown and made her way to the observation deck at the appointed time. The stars twinkled overhead as Dominic approached, his usual smile in place. "Thanks for coming," he said. "There's something I want to tell you." He gestured toward a secluded corner where they could speak privately. As they sat down, Dominic took a deep breath, his expression serious. "I want to be honest with you, Emily. I haven't been completely upfront about who I am." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "I'm not just any traveler," he said, his gaze unwavering. I come from a family of investors, and I manage several businesses. It's something I've tried to keep private to avoid the assumptions that come with my name. What assumptions? She asked, intrigued. That I'm just a spoiled heir living off the family fortune. But that's not who I am, he said firmly. I wanted to build my own legacy and make my own choices. I hope this doesn't change how you see me. Emily looked at him carefully, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes. I don't know your family, Dominic. I know you. And I'm glad you shared this with me. A sense of relief washed over him, and he took her hand in his. Thank you, Emily. I don't want to hide things from you. As they sat together under the stars, the night air thick with possibilities, Emily felt the first inklings of a love story that could change both their lives. But little did she know, the currents of Dominic's world ran deeper than she imagined, and they would soon be drawn into a tide neither could resist. Chapter 3: A Taste of Paradise. The following morning, the ship docked at another vibrant Caribbean island. The air was thick with the scent of tropical flowers, and the distant rhythm of steel drums floated on the breeze as Emily and Dominic disembarked together. With the sun beaming down and crystal clear water lapping at the shore, it felt like they had stepped into a paradise untouched by time. Their destination for the day was a secluded cove known only to the locals, and they took a short ride through lush jungles to reach it. The driver, a friendly local named Jorge, chatted enthusiastically about the island's history and culture. Emily marveled at the vibrant landscapes flashing by as they wound their way through the narrow roads. Arriving at the cove, Emily was struck by the serenity of the place. Soft white sand stretched out to meet turquoise waves, and tall palms swayed gently in the breeze. Dominic had arranged for a private picnic, and a large wicker basket awaited them under a canopy of palm leaves. This is amazing, Emily said as she slipped off her sandals and let the sand sink between her toes. Only the best for you, Dominic replied with a grin. They settled onto the soft blanket, and Dominic began unpacking the basket, revealing an assortment of fresh tropical fruits, cheeses, and a chilled bottle of champagne. As they savored their meal, the tension that had briefly flared between them seemed to melt away in the warmth of the sun. After they finished, Dominic stood up and offered his hand to Emily. How about a swim? She looked at him skeptically, glancing down at her sundress. I didn't bring a swimsuit. He smiled mischievously. That's never stopped anyone from enjoying the water. Emily laughed, and with a playful shake of her head, she slipped out of her sundress and waded into the cool waves in her underwear. Dominic quickly followed, and they splashed and swam until the sun hung high overhead. The hours drifted by, and eventually, they returned to their blanket, the sea breeze gently drying their damp skin. They lay back together, listening to the soothing crash of the waves as Dominic spoke of his travels, sharing stories of far-off places and fascinating people. And what about you? Dominic asked, propping himself up on one elbow to face Emily. Where do you see yourself going next? Emily was silent for a moment, considering the question. I've spent so long working, I don't think I've taken the time to think about that, she admitted. But maybe somewhere with more sun, more joy. A place where I can find some balance. Dominic studied her intently. And do you think you'll find it? I hope so, she replied softly. He reached out to brush a stray curl from her forehead. I think you will. You're too determined not to. Their eyes locked, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade away. Dominic leaned closer, and Emily felt her breath hitch as his lips brushed against hers. The kiss was gentle, lingering with a promise that set her heart racing. When they finally pulled away, Emily could see the same warmth in his gaze that she felt in her chest. Come on, Dominic said with a grin. I think it's time for a little adventure. He led her up a winding trail through the dense palms to a hidden viewpoint overlooking the vast Caribbean Sea. The view took Emily's breath away. The turquoise waves stretched endlessly to the horizon, and the sky was ablaze with oranges and pinks as the sun began to set. Dominic wrapped his arm around her shoulders as they stood there, watching the sun dip below the water. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he murmured. Emily leaned her head against his shoulder. "It's perfect." They stayed until the stars twinkled above and the moon cast a silver sheen over the sea. As they made their way back to the ship that evening, Emily felt as if she was floating on air. Dominic had shown her a side of paradise she hadn't known existed, and she didn't want the day to end. But even as they strolled hand in hand along the quiet deck of the ship, Emily couldn't shake the sense that there was something more lingering on the horizon. The joy of the day was undeniable, but a shadow seemed to flicker just beyond the edge of their bliss. For now, though, she pushed those thoughts aside, choosing instead to savor every moment of their newfound closeness, unaware of the undercurrents that would soon challenge their idyllic romance. Chapter 4: Dark Currents. Emily awoke the next morning to the rhythmic sway of the ship as it gently cruised toward the next island. The warmth and joy of the previous day lingered like a soft haze around her as she dressed for breakfast. She couldn't help but smile, remembering the way Dominic's eyes had lit up when they shared that secluded sunset at the viewpoint. As she approached the dining room, she found Dominic already seated at a table near the window, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. He greeted her with a warm smile and beckoned her over. "Good morning, Emily," he said, pouring her a cup of coffee. "I was wondering when you'd join me." "Good morning, Dominic," she replied, sitting down across from him. "I couldn't miss breakfast with you." They shared a leisurely meal, exchanging stories and glancing out at the rolling sea every now and then. But Emily noticed that Dominic seemed more subdued than usual. His gaze wandered frequently to the window, and he drummed his fingers on the table as if distracted by some invisible force. "Is everything all right?" she asked gently. Dominic looked at her, his brow furrowing for a moment before he gave a reassuring smile. "Yes, of course. I just have a few things on my mind." The reply didn't quite convince Emily, but she decided not to press further. After breakfast, they spent the day exploring the ship together, strolling through art galleries, browsing boutiques, and soaking up the sun by the pool. Though Dominic seemed to relax as the day wore on, a shadow remained behind his eyes. That evening, after dinner, Dominic excused himself and left abruptly, saying he had some business to attend to. Emily wandered the ship alone, feeling the first stirrings of uncertainty about their relationship. Was he hiding something from her? She tried to brush the doubts aside but couldn't ignore the pang of worry settling in her chest. She decided to head to the lounge for a nightcap and found a quiet corner near the bar. As she took a sip of her drink, she overheard two men talking a few seats away. "You've heard about Dominic Harrington, right?" one said in a low voice. "He's involved in some kind of business dispute back in New York." The other man nodded. "Yeah, I heard something about that too." "Something about a hostile takeover." Emily's stomach twisted at their words. She quickly finished her drink and left the lounge, her thoughts racing. She knew Dominic hadn't been entirely open about his business dealings, but the idea of a hostile takeover involving him seemed far removed from the charming man she had come to know. Back in her cabin, she paced restlessly before finally deciding to confront Dominic. She found his suite and knocked softly. He opened the door, surprised to see her. "Emily, is everything all right?" he asked, stepping aside to let her in. "I'm not sure," she said quietly. "I overheard some people talking about you tonight." Dominic's jaw tensed slightly. "What did they say?" "That you're involved in some sort of business dispute back in New York." "A hostile takeover?" He exhaled slowly and gestured for her to sit down. "I was hoping to avoid talking about this here," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "But yes, there's some truth to what they said." "What's going on?" Emily asked, her concern growing. My family owns a company back in New York, and I've been working to expand our investments, he explained. But one of our partners has become difficult. They're trying to push us out, so I've been negotiating to retain control. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, searching his eyes. Dominic sighed and took her hands in his. I didn't want to burden you with this, Emily. This was supposed to be a chance for us to enjoy ourselves, away from the chaos of the business world. But it's affecting you, Dominic. You've seemed so distant today, she said softly. You don't have to handle this alone. He looked into her eyes, his expression torn between gratitude and resignation. I'm so used to carrying this weight on my own. But you're right. I can't do it all by myself. They sat together for a long while, speaking quietly about his business troubles and the uncertainty surrounding the future. Emily listened intently, offering her support and reassurances. Finally, Dominic leaned back and closed his eyes, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. Thank you, Emily, he said, for being here. I don't know what I would have done without you. Don't worry, she whispered, stroking his arm gently. We'll face this together. But even as they held each other close, the dark currents of the outside world threatened to pull them apart. And Emily knew that their love would have to withstand even greater challenges if they were to emerge unscathed. Chapter 5: Stormy Waters. The ship docked at a vibrant port early the next morning, but the joy of new discoveries and romance was tempered by the tense conversation of the previous night. Emily could see the strain in Dominic's expression as they joined the other passengers disembarking for a day of exploring the island. Despite her best efforts to cheer him up, his usual charismatic demeanor had dimmed. They wandered through the local markets, and Emily was struck by the vibrancy of the island. Merchants called out to tourists from their stalls, offering jewelry, colorful sarongs, and exotic spices. However, Dominic remained withdrawn, barely glancing at the wares around him. How about a fresh coconut? Emily asked, pointing to a vendor cutting coconuts open with swift, practiced strokes. Dominic managed a small smile. Sure, let's give it a try. They sipped the cool, sweet coconut water and tried to immerse themselves in the lively atmosphere, but the shadow of the looming business crisis lingered. Finally, Emily couldn't bear the silence any longer. Dominic, we can't pretend this isn't affecting you, she said gently as they found a quiet spot near the beach. I know things are difficult right now, but you have to let me in. Dominic looked at her, the worry clear in his eyes. I'm sorry, Emily. I hate feeling like this. Trapped. You're not trapped, she said firmly. We're in this together, remember? We can get through this. He took a deep breath and nodded. You're right. I just need to handle this carefully. As they returned to the ship that evening, Dominic's mood seemed to lift slightly, but the weight of uncertainty still hung in the air. After dinner, he asked Emily to meet him on the deck for a quiet moment beneath the stars. The moon was high, casting a silver glow over the water as they stood by the railing. Dominic wrapped his arm around Emily's shoulders, and she leaned into him, relishing the warmth of his embrace. Whatever happens, Dominic, I'm here for you, she said softly. He kissed the top of her head. And I'll be here for you, no matter what. The ship's horn suddenly blared, shattering the tranquility of the moment. They turned to see a commotion near the entrance to the deck as two men in tailored suits approached them, accompanied by a security guard. Mr. Harrington, one of them called out. Dominic immediately recognized the voice. He tensed and stepped away from Emily, his expression hardening. What are you doing here, Richard? Richard Baldwin, a shrewd and ruthless businessman with whom Dominic had clashed repeatedly over the years, stood before them with a thin, insincere smile. Dominic, it's good to see you. I can't say the same, Dominic replied, his tone icy. Richard ignored the jab and gestured to his companion, a short man with a receding hairline. This is my attorney, Mr. Graves. We need to discuss a few pressing matters regarding the company. Dominic crossed his arms over his chest. I told you I'm on vacation. Whatever business you're here for can wait until I'm back. I'm afraid it can't, Richard replied, his smile fading. There are changes happening right now that require your immediate attention. Emily watched the exchange nervously, sensing the rising tension between the two men. She stepped closer to Dominic and placed a hand on his arm. Dominic, what's going on? Dominic glanced at her, his eyes troubled. It seems Richard and his team have decided to escalate matters. You're not going to fight this here and now, are you? She asked, her voice low. I'm afraid it might come to that, he said grimly. Richard, I'm not going to play your games. Whatever you're trying to pull won't work. Richard shook his head, pulling a document from his pocket. It's not a game, Dominic. This is a legal notice indicating that our firm is moving forward with acquiring your shares. Dominic's face blanched. You can't be serious. Very serious, Richard replied with a smirk. I suggest you reconsider your position. Otherwise, you might find yourself out of a job. Dominic crumpled the document in his fist and turned away, seething with fury. Emily quickly followed him as he stormed down the deck, leaving Richard and his attorney behind. Back in his suite, Dominic paced restlessly, his face flushed with anger. I can't believe they'd stoop this low, he muttered. Emily placed a calming hand on his arm. Dominic, we need to think this through rationally. What can we do? He stopped pacing and looked at her, his gaze softening. You're right. I'm going to need all the help I can get. They spent the rest of the night poring over documents and drafting a strategy to counter Richard's hostile takeover attempt. As the hours wore on, Dominic felt a renewed determination to fight back. With Emily's unwavering support, he knew they could face this challenge together. But even as the storm raged outside, there was a quiet strength between them that couldn't be shaken. They knew their love would be tested in the days to come, but they were ready to face the turbulent waters ahead. Chapter 6: Safe Harbor. The tension from the previous night's confrontation lingered in the air like a thick fog as the ship continued its journey toward the next island. Dominic and Emily had spent hours strategizing and brainstorming, yet the legal battle ahead seemed like a treacherous mountain to climb. Still, there was a resolve in Dominic's eyes, and Emily felt a newfound closeness as they navigated this challenge together. They docked at the final port, and with a renewed sense of determination, Dominic reached out to his lawyers back in New York, detailing the plans they had developed overnight. He spent hours on the phone, dictating strategies and reviewing financial documents. Emily remained by his side, offering quiet support as the clock ticked on. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Dominic ended the call with a weary sigh. He turned to Emily, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion, but a flicker of relief shining in his eyes. Looks like we've bought ourselves some time, he said. Richard won't be able to take control before the next shareholders' meeting. It's not over, but it's a good start. Emily smiled and wrapped her arms around him. That's great news, Dominic. We'll figure out the rest together. The following morning, the ship began its final leg back to port. The air was cooler, and the skies had turned overcast as if signaling the end of the journey. Dominic and Emily spent their last day at sea savoring their time together, retreating to a quiet spot on the deck to watch the waves crash against the hull. Dominic reached for Emily's hand and held it tightly. Thank you, he said softly. I couldn't have done this without you. You would have, Emily replied with a gentle smile. But I'm glad I was here. He brushed a lock of hair from her forehead and leaned closer. I want you to know something, he said, his voice low. I don't care what happens with the business. I'm not going to let anything get in the way of what we have. Emily felt her breath catch in her throat. Are you sure? I've never been more certain of anything, he replied, his eyes locked on hers. This journey hasn't been easy, but it's shown me what really matters. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Emily gasped as he opened it to reveal a delicate ring set with a single sparkling diamond. Emily Wilson, will you be my safe harbor? Will you marry me? He asked, his voice filled with hope. Tears sprang to Emily's eyes as she nodded, her smile growing wider with each passing second. Yes, Dominic. Yes, I will. He slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her close, their lips meeting in a kiss that was warm and full of promise. The ship's horn echoed in the distance, and they held each other as if to seal the moment. The final days of the cruise flew by, and soon they were back on land, facing the uncertain world beyond. Dominic returned to New York, where he confronted Richard and his team with a newfound strength. With the support of his family and Emily by his side, he successfully retained control of the business, securing his legacy and protecting the company from the hostile takeover. In the months that followed, Emily transitioned out of her high-stress job and found a new role at a smaller advertising agency, where she thrived with the balance she had sought for so long. Dominic and Emily married in a beautiful ceremony on the same secluded Caribbean beach where they had once shared a perfect day. As the waves gently lapped at the shore and the sun cast a golden glow over the horizon, they knew they had weathered the storm together and found their safe harbor at last. The challenges they had faced had only strengthened their bond, and they looked forward to a future filled with love, adventure, and unwavering support.